Hello, it's great to be here. My name is Cecelia Garibay. I'm principal of Garibay Group, where we focus a lot on equity and research and evaluation in the informal learning field, so museums and cultural organizations broadly. How are you?
I am good. I am Tonya Matthews. I am the Director of Inclusion for the American Alliance of Museums. And one of our very big projects right now is the Facing Change Initiative, where we're trying to move the dial on equity and inclusion at the board level, in addition to all of the work that AAM is interested in at all levels. And so I think that brings us to kind of the question of the day, which is when we think about DEAI, diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. Let's start with the basics. So why would you say, if someone asks you, why is it even important to measure something like this? Like, why would we do that? How do you respond to that question?
Wow. I always think of it in two ways, right? There's the what we often used to think of or call the business case, which is really about what is the mission and function of museums, and then what does it mean to be operating in a world as multicultural and as global as we are today, and can you actually be viable both from a mission-driven perspective as well as a business-driven perspective, and think about yourself in the sustainable way if you don't address it. So for me, it's often very much just the imperative is really, as institutions who are very much mission-driven, if you really want to fulfill that mission, that really means thinking about an inclusive environment in many ways. And I would argue if that isn't enough, right, then there's the issue of you're not going to survive as an organization in this kind of current field if you aren't thinking about those issues. What about you? How do you often, I'm sure you get asked that question a lot.
So, I do. And I think a lot of times it comes from a fear perspective. I think folks are very concerned. What if we don't like what we find when we actually measure this? And also, for lack of a better term, subjects of whom you are trying to measure, do they appreciate being counted? Do they want to answer these questions? And I think we spend a lot of time on truisms like, what we measure matters and it only counts if it's counted. And I actually choose to think in terms of we can only move that which we measure, right? So if you have any interest in moving something, changing something, fixing something, you actually have to measure where it is, literally to know whether or not you're moving, and hopefully to pay attention to which direction you're moving it in. And I think that one of the things that's happening is organizational DEAI is one of the only places where we don't measure DEAI. We're literally having a national debate about how to best manage the next American census, right? That's literally around that DEA conversation. We literally figure out our tax structure based on who's living in the communities and what they're making and what they're bringing to the table. We organize our voting lines in sort of these ways. And so in all of these different spaces and cases, we are measuring the different components and different participants and different ideas inside of DEAI, but organizations seem to be troubled by or resisting that. And so part of one of the big challenges of not measuring it is your world is measuring it and taking it into account.
I would argue that first and foremost, your community context really is critical in understanding your place as an organization and sort of the link, right? So if you think about an ecosystem perspective of across what is the role that your organization plays, what are those strengths, and how is that really fitting into the rest of the community? So to me, that community context becomes really important. I think it's really hard, though, in today's world not to also be thinking about a much more national and global context as well. So I think of it as a very nested approach, right? And the particulars may change depending on who you are as an organization and what's happening in your community, but I think it's really being attentive to those levels. And of course, I also would be remiss to not say that part of the context is your field. So part of it is, as a museum field, whether you define yourself in terms of cultural organizations or informal learning organizations or just in the field of education. I think those are all contexts in which thinking about where are you in relation to where the field is, and do you want to be on the leading edge of that, or where in that process are you?
So I completely agree with you, particularly around when it comes to context in community, right? So I have sort of two ways I think about that. One, because the conversation of diversity and inclusion is personal, right? But it's also personal to your organization and personal to your community. Different communities have different histories with different demographics, different challenges. And so one community may want to focus on African American males. One community may want to focus on Latina females. One community may find that it is the right time to get into this transgender and gender identity conversation based on not just what's happening nationally, but what's happening at home. And say, for example, you are a community that has a history with internment camps or a strong history with police brutality. You've got to sort of keep that in context as you decide, particularly as a museum, where you want to be transformative, where you want to step in, where you want to engage. The flip side of that, which I see folks do often, is never let your context be your excuse for defining a low bar. Right? Which is if you are in a community or in a sector or in a field that struggles with this level of diversity or that level of inclusion, and you happen to be a little bit above the norm, well, if the norm is an F, okay, we are not going to celebrate a D plus kind of thing. And so I think that's one of the other challenges with context. You want to be authentic and you want to make meaningful impact. And that's why you consider your context. But you don't want to allow how challenging it is and how challenging it has always been be a reason that you aim low, and think through being complacent around diversity and inclusion. And I think often I do see that. And so I think comparing yourselves, I think museums can do a little bit better at comparing ourselves within sector and outside of our sector. But as we do that, to pick the appropriate matches, while at the same time not being afraid of learning from folks who may have more capacity or more this or more history. I think it's really a balancing act. I'm actually an engineer by training, right? And so I have to remember that numbers tell me stories, and they always have. And I have to remember to translate that, right? And so I think part of it is actually, yeah, I'm going to need some hard data. I'm going to need numbers. I mean, they're tough, but they rarely lie. You know, occasionally they'll mislead. But you want to combine those things, right? And I think the real trick is to the art of measuring the soft stuff. So say, for example, our classic question, would you recommend us to a friend? I think that we're not quite creative enough in terms of how we ask the questions to get those numbers.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very true. And I think there's also this notion of looking at your data in deeper ways, right? So exactly as you mentioned, so you have a set of data, but you can break that down in different ways so that you can see, when I look at this data by age, what story does that tell me? When I break it down by gender, does that tell me a different story? And you're right, looking at that deeper level is really part of what is an important part of the process. 3 to 5 meaningful questions that if you had information on that, you felt you could act on, right? And so part of it is you can ask many things, but if you're not able to act on it, it's not particularly helpful and you've spent a lot of time and money on it. So I think keeping it to those kinds of questions of 3 to 5 really key questions that you might ask if a particular thing. So if you're working with your board, are there 3 or 5 major things, for example, that you might want to know about? Do you want to know about their satisfaction in terms of being on the board? And again, breaking it down by by a number of different things like gender, race, ethnicity, and so forth? Are you wanting to know, or would it be helpful for you to understand how much the diversity, equity, inclusion, and access are a priority, right? Those are many ways of thinking about that. So I think it's small. If you're thinking about it from a visitor standpoint and you're thinking more about an external audience, I would say the same thing. You might take a program, you might take an exhibit, you might think about your exit surveys. But again, think about 3 or 4 questions that you might want to even embed in something you're doing. But be really deliberate. I think one of the other pieces that we often don't make a lot of use of is what we know from the literature. There's some really good basic information that says, here are some key benchmarks of the kinds of things you might want to be looking at when you think about your DEAI work. And so that's a great place to pull from and say, oh, here are 3 or 4 things I could begin to really measure.
Mm-hmm. Deliberately pick something that is translatable, right? And go into it with the idea of translating the learning. For example, when we launched the Facing Change initiative, specifically focused on boards, and of all of the categories around diversity and inclusion, we decided that we would focus on race and ethnicity, because it is, and for the time being, will be a very important topic when we think about American culture. But we're doing it deliberately with an idea of how then to translate this. We really should not have to rewrite the book on inclusion every time we meet someone with a different kind of difference. We are really slowing ourselves down. And I think part of that is, as you pick these chunking pieces, that you are actively learning and recording the learning such that you can then translate that in whatever ways are possible to your next chunking piece, to your next adventure in DEAI. Because what I see is a lot of times we make the learning so discrete that we start from scratch again.
And the other piece that I think is important to be thinking about is this notion of your own reflective process as an organization, right? And so how are you really thinking about your own learning as an institution so that the evaluation, the data you may be getting are really something that you're taking in a way that may be helping to transform your own practice and really leading you further down a much more culturally competent way of thinking about the work that you're doing. And so I always sort of push a lot on this idea of reflective process and practice as part of any project, but I think even in evaluation and data gathering, that's a critical piece too to be considering.